Hey ladies and gentlemen, it's Timothy here. Now a little caveat about this video before I begin my review of the cards. I have actually played in pre-release by this point. So I've played in 5 pre-releases, that's 2 two-headed giant events and 3 single-person pre-releases. So from this point over in my reviews, I will have had some experience with a couple of the cards. I will say that red is the color I played the most. Red and green are the colors I played the most during the pre-releases. And out of all 5 pre-releases, including the two-headed giant events, I lost a total of 2 matches. So I feel like my reviews have been working out, at least for me. And I hope that they've been helpful to anybody who's watched them. So I'd love to hear if maybe these reviews were useful for you. The last thing I'll say before moving on is reminder that these reviews are geared towards draft. Of course, pre-release is sealed, but there's a lot of translation between those 2 formats. And like I said in a couple of the other videos, if I feel like something changes its value in sealed or loses value in draft or something along those lines, I will mention it. But again, this review is geared towards draft, and I haven't actually drafted the set yet, but I do have a little bit of experience with the cards from this point moving forward in the reviews. Now, with that being said, if you're still interested in what my rating scale is, it's here on screen. If you feel like pausing it, taking notes, critiquing, do what you will. But we're going to move on into the review. The first thing I'll say about red, no unplayable cards. Green, thankfully, was in the same boat. Last set, we had Dubious Challenge as our green non-playable card. Probably even Wily Bandar would make the list, in my opinion, or Commence Festivities. There are a lot of green cards that you just don't want to play, and red had a couple as well, with Madcap Experiments being a very disappointing rare that I remember, which I would have probably given a 0. But we're going to move on. There are no completely unplayable red cards, and we're going to look at the completely sideboard cards. Now, I've heard a lot of talk about this card, and a lot of people seem to really like it, and a lot of people think that it's probably okay to main deck this card. I would avoid that if I were you, and this is one that is based off my experience. Red is an aggressive color. Red wants to be attacking a lot. You do not want to spend turn 4 tapping out for an effect like this. Yes, it is going to get in 2 damage, and yes, it is a repeatable source of damage, but I just didn't see this card being something I ever wanted to board in, even in artifact-heavy matchups. There are better cards for this sort of effect. Not necessarily the passive damage, but for dealing with artifacts. And yes, this is a little bit of a wonky way to deal with artifacts, but there are ways around it. And at the most, you're going to get a 2-2, which isn't that great. Compare this to a couple of the other ways of dealing with artifacts, and I don't think you really want this card in your deck. I don't think I boarded it in a single time, even in matchups where I saw a ton of artifacts, and I kept it out of my main board, and it was played against me just a couple of times, and I just wasn't impressed with what it did overall. I don't think red wants a 4-mana artifact hate card, and honestly, my opinion is keep this in the sideboard. And if you want to board it in, it's still not going to be that crazy of a card. My inclination is that this card is much better in controlling red-based matchups, where maybe you're blue-red and you're trying to draw out the long game. Your red is there for removal, not necessarily for attacking with creatures. Then maybe I could see this card going up in value and even be in a win condition. But as is, I don't really love the card. Moving on, we've got a lot of narrow cards here. These are ones that I'm never happy to include in my deck. Or if I do include them in the deck, they're pretty much built around the effects, and they offer something in only one specific type of deck and don't really do much in the majority of decks that you're going to be drafting. Indomitable Creativity is a unique card. It's essentially a polymorph for a bunch of different things, and there are a lot of ways you can build around it. If you're a very heavy token deck, then Indomitable Creativity might have some value in your deck, but I don't see that happening in red, and the triple red cost here definitely pushes you towards a red-based deck. So I'm not entirely sure how to play this card or what it's going to do. My thoughts are that it's not unplayable, it's not completely bad, but you won't really want it most of the time. Ravenous Intruder is not a very good card in my opinion. I said this a lot with the black cards in my black review, and I'll say it again whenever it comes up in the red review. You have to have things that you're willing to sack here. Just sacking all your artifacts to this isn't great. It doesn't even have trample, and you're not really going to be getting in the damage. Not to mention your opponent's going to see it coming. It's not like they're not going to block and you're going to be able to produce a bunch of artifacts at instant speed. It's just not going to work out that way. So I have no idea why this card is being valued by some some players because it doesn't seem very good. And again, red's not really known for making a bunch of artifact tokens, so I don't really see the value in Ravenous Intruder. Wrangle's just a bad threaten effect. Threaten effects are usually good when you play them on really big creatures and try to win the game that way. Having that little stipulation about power 4 or less really nukes the power of it. Yes, it's probably playable, but it's not fantastic even when you do play it, and I would say stay away from Wrangle altogether. And then finally the Implement, which in my opinion is the worst of the entire cycle. The reason being is when I ask people whether or not they like this card, they say, well, yeah, it helps you improvise, or yeah, it helps you revolt. If you look through all of red, I believe red has 3 cards with improvise and 0 cards with revolt. So I don't really understand where that's going. Obviously, if you're in red-blue, and blue has a significant number more improvised cards, then maybe we can talk. But the effect is just completely insignificant. Red doesn't have a use for revolt, and the artifact synergies can be fulfilled with much better cards, so stay away from this. This should probably be a 0 in my opinion, but if you're in a certain color combination that needs revolt triggers and you can't get your hands on that color's implement, then Implement of Combustion might come in that case. The 3s. Now, it's always disappointing to have a rare that looks like it should be good this far down, but I actually don't think Karizev's Expertise is that good. It's not that much better than Wrangle. It says it can take a vehicle, but you still have to crew the vehicle, which is really annoying. It's sorcery speed, so there are no tricks you can do with it. And again, you want to be casting threaten effects like this towards the end of the game or when they're going to finish the game, which means by the time you're ready to cast Karizev's Expertise, you probably don't have a mana cost 2 or less spell in your hand to cast, or at least not one that's super significant. So they're kind of contradictory effects here. I will say this about Karizev's Expertise and Wrangle, that if you are playing black-red specifically and you have sacrifice effects, either things that sacrifice artifacts or creatures, the effects do go much higher up in value because being able to steal an opponent's card for the turn, attack with it, and then sacrifice it is a very strong ability, but it requires a very specific deck to work. Destructive Tampering is a card that's slowly going up. I've played this in three separate pre-release events, including two two-headed giant games, and it won pretty much every time I had the card in my hand. It was mostly the second effect here that was winning the games, but the first effect was relevant enough that I would be happy main decking this card. It looks like sideboard material because destroy target artifact is so specific, but what this card does is it offers you a modal spell with 2 wildly different effects, meaning you're basically adding 2 effects to your deck, 2 very diverse effects to your deck, but only taking up 1 card slot for it. And that's pretty nice. And that Magmatic Chasm effect, the second ability here, has just won me a couple games, and I've been killed by it too. Not to mention, if that's not going to win you the game and it turns out your opponent's playing a flyer deck or something along those lines, you still have the fallback of this being a useful card to destroy an artifact. And yes, almost every deck you play against is going to have a target for that. So I like this as a main board option. It is replaceable. And I say that because even though I think it's a strong card and it's a good main deck inclusion, if I were to start making cuts from my deck, I would look to cut something like this first. Alright, the builder rounds, and we'll see something very similar here. Not necessarily builder rounds, but the archetypal cards. These are similar to what we saw in black and blue. That is, decks that require you to have a pretty high concentration of artifacts in your deck in order for them to be good or actually really do anything. That's what we see here too. That's not to say that they're bad, just that they need the right kind of deck to work. Pia's Revolution and Ember Gear Smasher care about you having a bunch of artifacts. Probably Revolution more so than the Gear Smasher. If you only have 2 or 3 artifacts in your deck, you don't play this card at all. You need to have at least 7, 8 plus artifacts for this to even be relevant. And they have to be non-token sources of artifacts too. Actual tangible artifacts in your deck. And effects that you want to be getting back. If you're just sacking a bunch of combustions, then or combustion implements, that's not particularly exciting in my opinion. So Pia's Revolution is a card that I would urge people to play and test out, and if it just doesn't work out, then you stop playing it. But there is potential in the card, it just needs a specific deck to work. And Gear Smasher, again, same thing I said with the Ravenous Gremlin. This just isn't an exciting effect if you're sacking real artifacts for the effect. again, you shouldn't be throwing a bunch of Implement of Combustions in your deck, which are just really bad cards, in order to enable these suboptimal medium cards in the first place. Add in 2 really unexciting cards to make one really unexciting combo is just not going to set you up for success. The reason this card should probably be a little bit higher is because it is a 2/3 for 3, which is a very serviceable body, but the effect just isn't very exciting at all. Alright, now we're getting to the meat of things with the filler cards. These are cards that I may not be super happy to include in my deck, but I will play them and they go up in value in certain decks. Invigorated Rampage, I will admit, should probably be just a little bit higher because it adds a ton of damage to the board. It's basically a green combat trick. The only problem with it, and the only reason I think it's filler, is that it doesn't add any toughness to the creatures you're putting it on, so it's still going to end up trading probably 1 for 2 on your opponent giving an advantage there. It is a way to push in a lot of damage though, and in conjunction with the structural card, which can stop your opponent's creatures from blocking for the turn, you can probably just close out a game. It is cheap enough that I'm happy to include it, and maybe it should be higher, but if you're not looking to race your opponent on pure damage alone, the card is just a playable decent card. Siege Modification is a card that I'm already hearing tons and tons of stories about, and I love cards like that. This is actually a fine card, and the trick here is obviously to throw it on a vehicle and slam in for tons of damage, which is great, but I think this card is perfectly playable. Plus 3/0 and first strike on a creature is going to make that creature very hard to kill, at least in combat, and that should give you the push you need in red to push in a lot of damage. Obviously, if you're just playing this to make your 7/11 Consulate Dreadnought work, then I don't think it's that amazing. But if you are an aggressive deck, you want to be attacking, this can be something you throw on a creature that's no longer relevant in order to really push in damage. So I like the card, but it is an aura. It has the same risks as any aura does, and it is a very cuttable card if you don't have the support for it. Precise Strike is just a card that I think is a good combat trick, but I would rather have something else. There's just something about the total overall effect that it's not very exciting. It will probably win you combat. Most of the time, First Strike is significant, and the +1 power boost is pretty nice, but the card is just completely unexciting, and if I were looking to pick this up for my deck, I have a feeling I could pick it up really late in the pack. Sailback is just a filler card. Sometimes a red deck might need a big beater if you don't get something else, and this is a fine card. It gets better if you board it in against people who have a lot of really high toughness creatures, but altogether it's very unexciting. It's the definition of a filler card. Welder Automaton has, I don't know why people even look at the ability. I guess that's relevant, but it's not very good and not very mana efficient, and it's really not going to win you the game on its own. But the body here is a 2 mana 2/1 in colorless color, with no real color restriction. So if you were an aggressive red deck, this would be a filler 2-drop you could play if you needed a 2-drop. And then Frontline Rebel has the line of text that I hate most in Magic the Gathering, being forced to attack each turn of Able. I do not like this card. I do not see myself playing this card very often, but if you are an aggressive red deck, it's perfectly fine. I'll just say that's my personal bias. And if that is a real liability, then you could play a higher concentration of vehicles and be able to tap this to crew vehicles, meaning it doesn't have to attack for the turn. It's a fine card. There's nothing wrong with it. But at some point in the game, that will turn into a liability, and I don't particularly like cards that end up being a liability. Alright, sixes. These are the cards I'm starting to get excited about when I'm playing red. These are the cards that I'm looking to pick up a little earlier in the pack, and cards that I don't think will wheel very often. Reckless Racer has a decent little effect, but I think it's the first strike that pushes this into a 6th category creature. If this did not have first strike, I think it would be an easy 5, but first strike means it's going to be able to attack quite often, and it's going to be able to get in there and let you loot if you need to, or rummage as some people call it. When you discard first, it's keyworded rummage. But I think the card's just fine. It does pretty well on blocks, and it combines with the other first strikers in red to put up a pretty sizable defense if you need it. So red can play offense or defense here, and keep in mind if you crew a vehicle with this, you get the ability as well. So there's a lot of flexibility in the card. Sweatworks Brawler was a card I was pretty impressed with at this pre-release. Almost always coming down for 3 mana, if not less. The card was just a pretty big beater early enough in the game that it could get an attack or two in and threaten a double block, or threaten to force a double block from your opponent, at least eating one relevant creature. So I like it. I would play it in almost any red deck, probably multiple copies of it. And if I have more artifacts in my deck, I'm even happier to play it. And then Shock is a card that there's not really that much to talk about, but it's very good in this format. There are a lot of low toughness creatures compared to high power creatures, a lot of 3/2s for 3 mana and things like that. And Shock is just a very efficient way to deal with almost anything in the early game. There are a lot of 3 toughness creatures, case in point right here. So Shock's not going to deal with everything, but it is a nice way to finish a creature off, or at least stabilize in the early game if you need to. Alright, the 7s. These are cards I'm really happy to open. I want to be playing them in my deck. Kari Zev, I did get to play with once. It wasn't the most impressive card, but it was a decent sizable threat along with the monkey token that my opponents had to deal with it. They couldn't just ignore it. The first strike and menace combination is pretty nice, and it means that if you are on the play and you get this down on turn 2, you're probably going to get a good number of swings in, and the opponent's not going to want to trade for that monkey, which is basically like saying whenever Kari Zev attacks, deal 2 damage to target opponent. And that's not a direct analogy, but that is how it played out most of the games. Aether Chaser might be, in my opinion, one of the best red commons, if not the best red common. The card just does work. Having first strike on a 2-power 2-drop is very, very important, and very similar to the black Aether creature, the Aether Poisoner, with the same ability. It's positioned in a way that it's probably going to be able to use its energy to make at least 1 servo token. The Death Touch on the black one lets you get in pretty freely, or at least force a trade, and the Aether Chaser having first strike is very relevant along with this ability. I played multiple decks with Aether Chasers. It was one of the reasons that I decided to go red in a couple of my pre-releases, with one of my decks having 3 of these things, and the card impressed me quite a bit for a common. Release the Gremlins is a fantastic main deckable artifact destruction card. It's a 7 because there are times this won't be relevant, or it's going to be a little bit weaker than it could be. Your opponent just may not be playing a lot of artifacts. But if you are able to destroy 2 or more artifacts with this, this goes up to an easy 8, possibly a 9. Each 2/2 destroying an artifact is just ridiculous, and it's very flexible on the mana cost. It's reasonable. 5 mana to destroy 2 artifacts and get 2 gremlins, or 3 mana to destroy an artifact and get a gremlin is just a absolutely beating for your opponent. So I think this is a very first pickable card, and I'd be happy to play it, but it does lose out on bomb status for being very specific. Your opponents have to have artifacts in order for this to do anything. Chandra's Revolution is red's primary removal spell in common, at least at common here, and a very good one from what I saw. 4 damage is enough to kill almost everything that comes out by turn 4, and the tap in a land is actually pretty relevant, especially when people are trying to splash for these gold cards. It's a nice way to punish them for that, at least for a turn. But this is just sorcery speed removal. It's clunky in multiples. I said the same thing about the 4 mana black sorcery that destroys a creature or vehicle. You can't just put 5 of these in your deck and be super happy with it. You do have to have some flexibility in your removal, but this will do a good job. I would play at least 2 or 3 in most of my limited decks. And then Enraged Giant is a card that I didn't see come up very often. It is an uncommon after all, but it seems like it's going to play out very well. If you can reduce the cost of this by at least 1, it turns into a pretty good card. If I had to pay a full 6 for this, I'm less excited about it because my opponent's probably going to be prepped for the hasty part of it. But at 5 mana or even 4, if that's possible in your deck, this becomes an actual threat that your opponent's going to have to deal with and may not see coming. 4 hasty damage is actually quite a bit, especially if you can get this down on 4 mana. I think that's the sweet spot where this turns into a great card, with 5 mana still being a respectable beater. And talking about the 8s, we've got a good number of 8s here. And starting off with Hungry Flames, this is just very good removal. This is the type of card that I see past and shows me that red is open, which would encourage me to start drafting red. Hungry Flames decided a lot of games during pre-release weekend for me on both ends of the table. The extra 2 damage is relevant in Limited. And the 3 damage to a creature is enough to take out pretty much everything in the format that comes down before turn 6. With it also being a good option to finish off a creature and deal a little bit of incidental damage to an opponent. It's just solid removal, and even if it didn't have the 2 extra damage tacked onto it, it would still be a fine card, so having that 2 damage just pushes it up a little bit. Scrapper Champion is very vulnerable when it comes down. It does die to shock. It dies very easily to cards like Prey Upon, but it ever gets 1 attack in and your opponent's just doomed for the rest of the game. If they cannot remove this, it can spiral out of control very, very quickly, which leads me to believe that it's probably Red's premium uncommon, if not tied with Hungry Flames here. Lightning Runner is a card that I obviously didn't see come up very much. We did have it in a 2-headed giant pool, but decided not to play it on account of not really having a lot of energy sources, but it's one that really interests me, and I think if you ignore the energy ability altogether and just evaluate this as a 5-mana 2/2 with double strike and haste, that would at least be a 6 or 7 in my opinion. And the fact that you can build around this and take it early and build some sort of red-based energy deck leads me to believe that there are some real blowouts that you can have with this card. It's a unique effect. There is no other effect in this format that's going to give you an extra combat. So uniqueness doesn't always equate to powerful, but when you're talking about a very aggressive deck and you can pull this ability off, then I think this card is an easy 8. And then Free Gem Regent should probably just be a 9. The card super impressed me during pre-releases. It just deals so much damage. Even if it comes down on turn 6, that's an easy 7 in my opinion. The Improvise is absurd on this card. If you can get it for 4 or 5 mana, you probably just win the game if your opponent can't remove it. And the +2/+0 for 2 mana is basically just fire breathing and lets you push in for so much damage. This is an easy 2 to 3 turn clock when it comes down, no matter when it comes down, and it's so threatening that your opponent has to deal with it. Not to mention your opponent's flyers probably aren't going to be big enough to block this by the time this comes down, so it gets some pretty easy attacks in, and it can attack for a lot. Alright, and I believe this is the final card here. Sorry, Red, no 10s, but Quicksmith Rebel seems very impressive to me. I haven't played with or against the card, but 2 damage over and over again on an artifact is really, really insane. Now, the thing that stops us from being a 10 is how fragile the body is for the mana cost. 4 mana 3/2 is not really anything to write home about. 2 toughness means it dies to shock, it dies to prey upon, it dies to pretty much every removal spell in this format that's based on power or toughness. But the ability is super worth it. Again, just like I said with the Free Gem Regent, if your opponent doesn't remove this right away, they're dead. This is going to pick off all of their little creatures. It's going to pick off all their tokens. And then at some point in the game, if you're not picking off creatures, you're just zinging them for 2, while also adding a body to the board. It's a little bit situational. You do have to have an artifact on the board that you can be tapping, so keep that in mind. This isn't just a free card, but just like the blue Quicksmith, I think this card is absurdly powerful in the right kind of deck. And if your opponent can't remove it, it could carry you to victory on its own. And no, I can't name any 10s here. I'm sorry. Maybe Quicksmith is a 10, but I think the fragility on the card leaves it at 9 range at best. But I'd love to hear if you guys think there are any tier 1 bombs in red. I don't think there's anything on par with Herald of Anguish or the Basilisk or Baral's Expertise. I do think those are 10s, but red didn't strike me as anything that had something amazingly powerful. Now, with that being said, the next up is white, and then I'll be looking at the artifacts, multicolor cards, and the 1 land in the set. So, as always, I hope this is useful for you. I know pre-release weekend has passed by the time you'll see this video, but I hope with drafts coming up starting next Friday that you guys could use this to your benefit. It definitely helped me a lot. At least just speaking out loud and putting my opinions out there helped me a lot in my pre-releases, and I'm very satisfied with how things went. So if this helped you, give me a thumbs up, and if it didn't, give me a comment and tell me what you think would be different, or what you think was different based on your experience. With that being said, my name's Timothy. Stay tuned for the white review coming up probably in a couple days, and I will see y'all next time.